get here than I would have liked to, but thank you for being patient. Today we have a double Torah portion, Tazria and Metzora, which is in the book of Vayikra, which is Leviticus, and it all begins in the Blue Art Scroll Chumash on page 608. So, the double Torah portion has similar subjects, and I would say the overriding theme of these two Torah portions is the proper and permissible use of words, of communication, of language, of speaking. But before we get to that, we're going to spend a little time on chapter 12 of Leviticus, which is the opening first 8 verses of the Torah portion of Tazria. What is the opening section about? It's about childbirth. A baby boy or girl that was born and the laws of childbirth. What are the laws of childbirth? So obviously it includes circumcision, that when the baby boy is 8 days old, you shall circumcise the baby. That's number one. But in addition to that, the Torah says that there's a period of time that the mother should not go to the temple because she's in a period of tumah. Now, tumah in Hebrew means uncleanliness, impurity. And after that period, she goes to the mikveh to cleanse herself, and then she brings a karban, a sacrifice, to the temple, to the Bet HaMikdash. Now, there's a lot to be discussed here. We'll try to talk about some of it. And that is, why would a mother who gave birth to a baby, which there's nothing more beautiful and more miraculous than that, be rendered unclean, unholy, and need to wait a period of time before she's cleansed and only then able to come to the temple? That's number one. Number two is, what kind of a sacrifice does she bring? She brings a sin offering. What sin did she commit? She gave birth to a baby. What could be better than that? Why in the world would that be a sin offering? So in order to understand this, we just have to discuss in general the idea of cleanliness and uncleanliness. We are not talking about physical cleanliness or physical uncleanliness, obviously. This is not about physical hygiene. This is talking about spiritual cleanliness and uncleanliness. And the way the rabbis explain it is as follows. We know that the ultimate contaminant or defiler of purity, of holiness, of sanctity is a corpse, a dead body. That's the ultimate example. There are others, but that's the highest form. Why? Because life is synonymous with God. God is the source of life. Death is the absence of God, when the soul departs from the body. And therefore, there's a void of holiness, which is called tumah. The more connected we are to God, the more purity we have, the more holiness. But the more absent God is, so to speak, the more defilement we have. Now, do you think about what was happening when the mother was pregnant? Pregnancy is the biggest miracle known to man in our modern day, okay? Every time a woman is pregnant, the greatest miracle is occurring. Now, what do I mean by the greatest miracle? Life is a miracle too. The fact that right now we're all alive is a miracle as well. But we would all perhaps agree that creating a new life is the greatest miracle, because thank God, God is sustaining us and keeping us alive every single moment. And just now on the holiday of Passover, we said, Shechianu, V'kimanu, V'gianu, Lazman Hazeh. We give thanks to God that He sustained us for another year, because every moment that God is giving us breath and life is a miracle, no question. But creating something from nothing, starting with a few cells, and I hate to use a pedestrian word, but manufacturing a life, producing and creating a human being, with a divine soul from scratch, as you would say, there's no bigger miracle than that. So when you think about the womb of a mother and the miracle of birth, there's a tremendous godly force and power at work in the mother's womb, producing and creating this child. And, mothers who are pregnant like to buy books or go on the internet to see every week what's happening. And it's like over the 40 weeks, it's like now the lungs are being formed, now the brain is being formed, now the heart is being formed. And it's like unbelievable. From 1 week to the next, the baby has a heart, the baby has a brain, the baby has this. It's beyond belief. Okay. So when the baby's born, the biggest miracle comes alive, a baby. But as far as the woman is no longer a partner with God in creating a life, because the woman is God's partner in the creation. God can't do it without the woman. God needs her physical womb to be the laboratory, to be the manufacturing plant. And it's the woman who's eating and giving food to the umbilical cord, to the baby, right? Together with God, that are co-authoring and co-producing and co-creating a life. So from a woman's perspective, for those 9 months, she is almost like a co-pilot with God himself in creating a life. Now, obviously, God is doing 99.9% of the work, but the fact is, she is creating life together with God. Now, in that experience, when that period ends, there is an absence of that heightened level of holiness and creation of life. Therefore, there's this period of impurity. Now, when the woman finally concludes that, she goes to the mikveh, she becomes cleansed, she then brings a karban, a sacrifice. Now, there's a lot of commentary on why she brings a sin offering. One answer, for example, that's given is because when the woman goes through the pain of childbirth, she takes a vow that she's never going to do this again because it's so painful. And now she has to undo the sin of taking that vow and saying, I'll never do this again because it was so painful. After the baby's born, they forget the pain and ready to have another child, God willing. The other interesting answer is that it's, the whole impurity period is that God is saying, you don't need to come to the temple to connect with God. You have a baby in your bedroom, a little infant. Focus on the child in the bassinet. That is the closest you're going to get to seeing God. But another interesting answer to the sin offering, which perhaps ties into today, because today is Yom HaShoah, which is Holocaust Remembrance Day, is that, everyone celebrates when a baby is born. And they should celebrate. Why? Because a new life was created. And with that new life is a lifetime of potential. Okay, a baby's born, and this baby has infinite potential to do so many wonderful things in this world in their life, okay? But the fact and the sad reality is that not all babies do good things. Today is Yom HaShoah, and we remember the evil that was perpetrated not just by the Germans, and not just by the SS, and not just by the 15 members of the Wannsee Conference who in 1942 met and unanimously voted for the final solution. And these 15 people were all high-ranking German officials, and 8 of them had PhDs. They were very educated people. And yet they were able to vote for the annihilation and the final solution of the entire Jewish race, men, women, and innocent babies. Innocent men, innocent women, and innocent children. In other words, man has a capacity to be purely evil. And I mentioned this morning in my video, that, with all the gun shootings, maybe I didn't say it in my video, I said it in show actually, that, today we have all these debates about gun laws because of the mass shootings. And there are those who argue, well, it's not the guns that kill, it's the people that kill. And the people who kill are mentally ill. So what we need is mental health care for people who are mentally ill. But I think the Nazis prove that, nobody of the 15 members of the Wannsee conference were mentally ill. They were all normal people, but they were evil. Evil doesn't mean you're ill. Perspective, you're ill, but you're not necessarily mentally ill. You could be very sound-minded. You could even have a PhD after your name, which means you're very educated, but yet you could order the murder of innocent men, women, and children. It's human. The capacity of human evil is mind-boggling. And like I said, there were millions of Germans and Poles and other people who went along with all of this and even assisted and participated. So when a baby's born, we have to think about two things. Obviously, all the good and the potential for raising this child to be a wonderful human being who will do wonderful things in the world. But we also have to be aware that there's no guarantees. There are children who were born as cute little babies and turned out to be monsters. And therefore, no matter what, no human being is perfectly righteous. Everybody will commit sins. Everyone will do a certain amount of wrong in this world. And therefore, the mother brings a sin offering on our first opportunity to say, God, I will do my best to raise this child to be the most beautiful, wonderful human being that will only be a force of good and positivity and kindness and love and righteousness and everything wonderful. But I have to face reality. My child will do certain things, and I take responsibility as a parent. That's my responsibility, especially when they're young, to raise them properly. And therefore, I bring the sin offering almost like an advance, because I know there will be sins as a result of the birth of this child as well that will be committed. And it gives us a very sobering, but a balanced way to look at a child, that a child is not just, oh, beautiful, adorable, cute, let's have a good time. It's a wonderful blessing, but also a huge responsibility. You are raising a child who will go out into the world, and their actions to a certain degree will reflect. Their actions to a certain degree will reflect on their parents and the upbringing and so on and so forth. So that's just some of the ideas of the opening discussion of raising a child. And to take it one step further, I'm going to show you a very interesting contrast. Adam and Eve have a child, first child, and that child was named in Hebrew Cain. In English, he's called Cain. Now, what does the word Cain mean? Literally, it means, if you look at when she names her baby, think about it. She's the first woman to give birth. I mean, today we look at a birth and we're like, wow, what a miracle. Imagine being the first woman to experience a baby being born from her body, unlike the way Eve and Adam were created, handiwork of God. So she says, Kaniti ish et Elokim, which means I have acquired a child from God. The word kayan is from the word koneh, to acquire. It could also be translated loosely as I've created, but literally means I've acquired. And what happens with that first baby? Talk about evil. That baby turns out to be a murderer. And who does this baby murder? His brother, Hevel, Abel. So the very first story about the first child is a story of murder. That's the first human child. What about the first Jewish child? First Jewish child is Isaac, born to Abraham and Sarah in their old age. And what happens? God says, take Isaac and offer him on the altar. And Abraham is ready to offer him as a sacrifice. And Isaac is ready to be offered up until the angel says, no, it's just a test. Now think about the contrast of these two stories and what it's teaching us. There's two ways to view your children. One way is the way the mother of Cain experienced it. When she, Chava, Eve, said, I've acquired a child. She saw her child as her possession, something she acquired. And that child turned out to be a murderer, because that mindset of I own my children, they're mine, isn't the proper way to raise a child. What's the proper way to raise a child? The way Abraham did. Abraham said, look, God, you gave me this child in my old age. I waited my whole life, but I know it's your child, not mine. I'm just entrusted with the sacred responsibility and task of raising this child, but it's for your sake and the way you want the child to be raised. And therefore, when you ask me to surrender this child as an offering, I'm ready to do that because it's not my child, it's your child. And that's the mindset of a Jewish parent. God entrusted me with these souls, and it's my privilege, honor, pleasure, and also duty, responsibility, obligation to raise this child in accordance to the way God wants this child to be raised, because God made this child for me to raise for his service. And therefore, the decisions the parent make are not solely based on what their interests are or what their desires are, but based on what Hashem wants. As the Talmud says, there are three partners in the creation of a child. There's the mother, there's the father, and then there is God. God is the third parent, the third partner in the creation of every child. Now, feel free to text in the chat box a question if you want to ask a question. So we're still on Zoom thanks to the pandemic, which gave us this wonderful tool, and it's terrific. But I don't want anyone to feel like it's not a class. You could ask questions as you please. One last thought I wanted to touch upon, and that's about circumcision, and actually make it two thoughts about circumcision. You know, we just came from the holiday of Passover, and the two mitzvot that more Jews observe than any other of the 613 mitzvot is Passover Seder. That's a great question, Pablo. I'm going to answer that in a second. Passover Seder and Brit Milah, circumcision. The most secular, alienated, assimilated Jews still go to usually to some Passover meal and circumcise their children. Now, someone asked the question, Pablo asked the question, how is the sacrifice brought today? So we don't bring any sacrifices. Prayer in the synagogue is the substitute. The sanctuary is the tabernacle, and prayer is the offerings we give to God, our heartfelt prayers. And yes, I'm really glad you asked the question, because many, many women have the custom that the first time they leave the house, they make sure that their first trip is to the synagogue. So, for example, I remember sometimes when my wife gave birth and she was home with the baby for a period of time from the hospital, and then she had to go to the first pediatrician visit. First time she's leaving the house to go anywhere, but she wouldn't go to the pediatrician. First, she would come with the baby to the synagogue, say a prayer of thanks to God, and then go to the pediatrician. So that the first trip with the baby, like in the olden times, is to the temple to God, to recognize that. So going back to circumcision. Circumcision, and by the way, there's only two positive commandments. There are a lot of negative commandments that if you violate them, the punishment is karet, which means you're spiritually cut off from the Jewish people. But there's only two that the punishment is karet that are positive commandments. One is eating the Paschal lamb in the olden days when we had the sacrifice, which is the Seder, and one is circumcision. So it's a very important commandment, obviously, Brit Milah. But the first question I wanted to address is, the Torah says on the 8th day you should circumcise the child. Why the 8th day? What is it about the 8th day? Now, medically, people have now discovered that that's the best day with the coagulation of the blood. Medically, it's a good time, but what's the spiritual reason? And we could spend the rest of the class just talking about Brit Milah, but obviously we don't have time because we want to talk about other things. But one of the beautiful ideas about Brit Milah is that it's on the 8th day. Why? So let me just say two other things about the number 8. First of all, last week's Torah portion was Shmini, number 8. And second of all, we're now counting the Omer. Today's the 12th day of the Omer. If you didn't count yet, you could still count. Today's the 12th day, which is 1 week and 5 days into the Omer. And we count 49 days to Shavuot. Now, what is Omer? Omer is actually a barley offering that was bought in the temple on the second day of Passover. So we count from the day that the barley offering was a 7-day holiday. Shavuot in Israel is 1 day, but we keep 2 days in the diaspora, which goes into that whole discussion of they didn't know the calendar and so on and so forth. It was based on the sighting of the moon and so on and so forth. So outside of Israel, they had to send messengers who didn't get there in time and so on and so forth. So some people say that Shavuot is the 7 day. Passover is the 7 days, and Shavuot, which comes after 49 days of counting the Omer, is the 8th day of Passover. Now, why would you say Shavuot is the 8th day of Passover? So here we come to a beautiful story in the Talmud. The Talmud says that someone once challenged Rabbi Akiva, the great rabbi, and said, Rabbi Akiva, what's with this commandment to circumcise your children? And he said to him, what's better? So God made a baby. Why would you now circumcise the baby? Are you saying that your work is better than God's work? You're going to improve on God's work? To give you an example, imagine you went to the Louvre in Paris and you saw the Mona Lisa and you said, I think I could improve. Let me take out my paintbrush and add a little color here, or let me scratch off a little color. Like, this is the Mona Lisa. God made this beautiful baby. He did a perfect job. Brain, heart, lungs, kidneys, livers, organs, blood vessels, unbelievable. Miracle of miracles. And you're going to now take a knife and do something else? Mutilate the baby? Scar the baby? What are you doing? Are you implying that you could do better than God? If God wanted to make the baby circumcised, he could have made him circumcised. Now, there's a lot of answers to this question. But this is what Rabbi Akiva did. Rabbi Akiva said, yes, the handiwork of man is greater than the handiwork of God. And he said, what do you mean? So Rabbi Akiva took out a bushel of wheat and a loaf of bread. And he said, what do you prefer, the wheat or the bread? God made the wheat, but we turned it into bread. So there's beauty in nature, but the greatest beauty is when you elevate nature and refine nature. So if you look at a field of grass, it's beautiful. But if you look at a beautiful garden, which is planted the most beautiful flowers and organized in the most beautiful way, right? Magical gardens, right? They're beautiful, right? Because man improved on what God gave us. And that's what God wants us to do in this world. Circumcision is a symbol of our partnership with God. God said, I made this world, but you can improve on it. Why? Because God didn't make nature for it to just stay in the natural state. He wants us to elevate it. And barley, that's why on Passover, when we left Egypt, we were like animals. We were slaves. We ate barley. Barley represents the food of animals. On Shavuot in the temple, they brought bread because we elevated it. So man can not only follow their natural tendencies and urges. There's a big mistake that many people make. When you go to the store, if something's natural, it's better, right? Oh, natural peanut butter, natural this, natural that. Everyone wants natural. It's natural the way God made it. But that is in comparison to all the junk and the chemicals that people put into things, right? But a lot of people, when it comes to their emotions, they're like, well, that's my nature. As though if it's my nature, it must be good. So I have to follow my nature. I have to be true to myself because that's the way God made me, right? So they think whatever they think or feel, because it comes naturally to them, must be the right thing. But God says, no, I made your nature, but you have to improve on your nature. You have to elevate your nature. So going back to Holocaust Remembrance Day today, remember 6 million Jews who were murdered. Is violence part of human nature? Yes. Now, you may say, well, I'm not a violent person, thank God. But there's different forms of violence. Violence could be physical, but violence could be verbal. That's why the rest of the Torah portion that we're going to read about is about Lashon Hara. I could assault you with my words. That's why there's something called verbal abuse. Is physical abuse, where I hit you, God forbid, and verbal abuse. Verbal abuse is a form of violence. I'm using my tongue as a weapon to hurt you, either by speaking behind your back negatively or to your face, saying something mean or insulting. So there is a violent streak. Now, not everyone. Some people have zero violence in them and they're just loving, peaceful people and they never want to say anything negative about anyone. They have no such desires, thank God. But I would say most people use their tongue improperly to speak negatively of others or so on and so forth. So they're using a violent nature. God says you have to control that. You have to channel that. You have to change that. You have to conquer that. Is jealousy natural? Yeah. People feel jealous many times. But just because you naturally feel jealous doesn't mean it's a natural good thing. You have to you have to overcome the natural urges that are negative. Now, love is natural, and kindness is natural, and faith is natural. A lot of wonderful natural things, but not everything that comes naturally to you is good. We have a lot of negative thoughts that are not good. They come naturally. So God says, yes, I made nature, and He made you with a nature. Greed, jealousy, hatred, violence, all these things could come very naturally to people. Lust, temptation, all of that. But certain urges need to be sublimated or conquered, or at least they need to be suppressed, okay? So the point is that the whole idea of circumcision teaches us, take what God gave you and now perfect it. And that's not an insult to God. That's what God gave us. He wants us to be partners in this world, in creating a beautiful world. And that's through our input and our effort. Another very interesting thought is, I don't know if you ever stop to think about this, but what is circumcision? And by the way, women are born circumcised. It's another whole subject. Women are on a higher spiritual level. They don't need that physical marker, so to speak, that physical sign. They were born that way. That's why God chose women to be His partners in creating life, not men. He could have chosen men or both. He chose women because they have a closer alignment spiritually to God. They're more in the image of God, so to speak. But going back to circumcision, God says, okay, I want to have a covenant in your physical flesh, which is remarkable. King David says he was once in the bathhouse and he got undressed to go into the mikveh. And then he said, oh my gosh, I'm naked from mitzvot, because in the bathhouse, he's not wearing his tzitzit. He can't say prayers. He can't think Torah words in the bathhouse. And then he looked down, he saw a circumcision. He said, oh, I'm not naked of mitzvot. I always have a mitzvah with me. So a brit milah is with you 24/7 for your entire life. So it's a permanent marker in your flesh. But if I asked you, okay, God wants to give us a commandment to make a permanent marker in our flesh, to always remember our covenant with Him. Where shall we put that marker? You would say maybe on my forehead, so I could see it every time in the mirror. Or maybe on my heart, because I have to love God. So on my heart, I should make a little incision, to remember God or something, Or maybe on my hand to remind me that my actions should always be good. From all the places that God asks us to make this marker of the covenant, God asks us to do it on our reproductive organ, on our lower extremity. Why would that be the place to make this covenant with God? It sounds like the last place you would ever think of. And obviously, like every question in Judaism, there are a lot of answers, and you could think of your own answers and offer your own answers, but two answers. First answer is very simple. The physical strongest urge and drive of man is, one of them at least, the sexuality. And sometimes people could act very animalistic. So by putting the circumcision on that organ, the Torah is saying is that godliness and holiness is not just for the spiritual moments of my life. Oh, when I go to synagogue, I connect to God. It has to permeate every aspect of your life, down to the most physical aspects of your life. The most physical drives in man have to be elevated and used in a sacred, respectful, holy way. That there's nothing out of the domain or out of the purview of Hashem. And every urge, whether it's the desire to make money or the desire to eat food or the desire for sexuality, there's the laws of kosher, there's the laws of Shabbos. We don't make money, we don't earn money on Shabbat, we take a day for God. There's the laws of family purity about how to have intimate relationships with your spouse, or the laws of who you're allowed to marry, who you're not allowed to marry, which relationships you're allowed are permissible, which is are forbidden. And you have to sanctify and elevate every part of your relationship with God. That's one answer. But another very powerful answer is as follows. There's two ways to have a relationship with God. One, and we need to have both. One is out of fear of God, awe of God, reverence of God, because God is the ultimate power, and we want to, we respect that power of God in the world and be humble in His presence. But the better way to serve God is not out of fear, out of love. And therefore, the Torah says, where you should have the circumcision on your organ. Why? Because that's where you're intimate. It represents this husband and wife relationship of love, of intimacy, of bonding, of connection. And precisely having a circumcision there represents the idea that our relationship with God should be like a husband and a wife. It should be out of love. It should be out of respect. It should be out of passion. And as we say in the Shema, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. It shouldn't be out of fear of God. It should be out of love for God, out of, use the word desire, right? Circumcision represents the idea of physical desire. That just like we have physical desires, we should have a spiritual desire for God. And that could be maybe one of the reasons why. And this analogy of God and man being a husband and wife, the Jewish people, is throughout the prophetic literature. Matter of fact, many people, when they put on their tefillin, if you look in the Hot Scroll Siddur, we put it around the ring like a finger ring, and we say, I will be betrothed to you with righteousness, with kindness, with fidelity. We talk about fidelity, right? There's fidelity in marriage, and there's fidelity to God. There's monogamy, one spouse, and monotheism, one God, Hashem Echad, right? Loyalty, fidelity, bond, connection. And many, Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, written by King Solomon, that was just read on Passover, is all about the love of a husband and a wife, a man and a woman. And it's an analogy for God and the Jewish people. So very much the circumcision reminds us of that special covenant, that special relationship that shouldn't just be out of fear, and it shouldn't even be out of like, it's a duty, it says in Pirkei Avot. We're learning the 6 chapters of Pirkei Avot now in the summertime. Between Pesach and Shavuot, we start learning it. Some people learn it all summer. And one of the Mishnot, they're very famous, says, don't be like the servants who serve their master to receive a reward, but do it like the servants who don't do it for the sake of reward. Meaning to say, you could serve God like a slave, like a servant, or like a child. A child does it out of love. A servant does it out of duty and obligation. So when you do a mitzvah, it should be like when you do something for your spouse. You do it with love. You do it with joy. You're happy to do it. Hashem doesn't want you to do the mitzvah like, I have to do this, like a job. It's not a job. You're in a relationship with God, and that's what circumcision reminds us of. So now in the remaining time, we're going to talk about the main theme of this week's Torah portion, and that is proper and improper speech. And a lot of laws, it's a double Torah portion. The second Torah portion, the first one is Tazria, which means give birth, or becomes pregnant, because it was about childhood. The second one is Metzora. The word Metzora has 2 words, Motzi Ra, someone who omits evil words. And I keep on going back to Holocaust Remembrance Day, because we have these ridiculous quotes in our society, and one of them is, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never harm me. I don't know why we teach that to children, right? And Judaism says, are you kidding me? Words will never harm me. First of all, words do a lot of harm. They wound people emotionally. They scar you. They could destroy you, the wrong word, especially spoken to an innocent child, God forbid, right? Who carries that, the impact for the rest of their lives. But it's much more than that. Words lead to violence. And today is the day that proves it. The Holocaust didn't begin with physical violence. When Hitler rose to power, it started with hateful words against the Jews, lies about the Jews, propaganda, disinformation, caricatures in the newspapers of Jews with long noses and money bags, right? And that gradually grew and grew and grew. People say, well, how did normal people go and murder 6 million Jews? How did that happen? It didn't happen one day out of nowhere. It happened after years of verbal besmirching and hatred against Jews. And that's why if you go to any Holocaust museum, typically when you walk into the museum, it begins with the newspaper articles and the pictures and the speeches that were given, because words lead to violence. And therefore, you have to stop violence with violent words, with hateful words, with anti-Semitic words, because they will eventually lead to violence and, God forbid, murder. Because once you dehumanize somebody, once you speak enough hatred towards a person that in the eyes of society, that person is not even a human being anymore. They're subhuman because you've painted a picture that this person is not as deserving of life as the rest of the human beings. Then they don't feel bad killing them because they're not even human beings, because the propaganda has already, and the Nazis really worked on that. It was part of the strategy, to depict pictures. I mean, I remember going to Yad Vashem just 2 years ago, and there's a whole new wing about Nazi photography and how every picture they published was very carefully chosen to depict Jews as less than human. And that's the way the human brain works, and that's the way they brainwash people. So words are very important. Even if they don't lead to violence, they're terrible. They're hurtful, they're painful, they cause tremendous, trauma and conflict and so on and so forth. To quote the Talmud says, Lashon Hara, which is negative speech, kills 3 people. It kills the one who speaks it, the one who listens to it, and the one who is spoken about. They're all poisoned by it. So it's like a knife. It kills the one who, and I'm going to tell you a conversation I overheard this morning, and I was laughing to myself. I was in the presence of 2 people. I was at a meeting. I shouldn't talk too much because it may come up. But the point is that someone said something about a certain person that I didn't want to do a deal with him because I don't trust him. Okay? I didn't want to. He said I did a deal with this guy, but I didn't want to do it with. Someone said, "Well, what about that guy? Why don't you do the deal with this guy?" So I didn't trust him. So the other guy said, "Why didn't you trust him? Why don't you trust him?" To which he responded, "Look, I don't want to speak Lashon Hara." I was laughing because he already spoke Lashon Hara. He already said, "I don't trust this guy." So you may not share the reason, which is more Lashon Hara. But the minute you said, I didn't do the deal with this guy because I don't trust him, that's Lashon Hara. You just told people at a meeting, there are another 3 people at the meeting, and they just heard that this guy can't be trusted. So what happens? Tomorrow, maybe this guy's thinking of doing a deal with this guy. And he would have done the business deal. But now he heard this guy say, I didn't trust him. So, someone said he didn't trust him. I'm not going to trust him, right? Now, is there any basis to the fact that he didn't trust him? Is that a fair comment? He may have just deprived this person from a business opportunity, right? So Lashon Hara really hurts and damages people. So a person in this world, the most valuable possession anyone owns is their reputation. That is the most value. Money you could regain. You lose some money, you could make some money. You could live with a little less money. Whatever it is, it's not going to affect you so much. But your reputation in the eyes of others, that's your most prized possession. As it says in Pirkei Avot, Keter Shem Tov, a crown of a good name is the most important crown. If you rob somebody of that name, now, I'm not saying there's never a place for saying anything negative. Somebody calls me for a reference about somebody for a job or for a marriage, right? And says, listen, I'm thinking of dating this person, or I'm dating this person. I need to know what if, and I hide it from them. They may end up marrying this person and be miserable, maybe get divorced. Or somebody wants to do business with somebody, and I know certain facts about the person, and I say, well, I don't want to speak Lashon Hara, so I'm not going to say anything. And then the person could lose a ton of money. Anything you would want somebody to tell you to protect you, you should tell somebody else. So obviously, there's a lot of rules. You can't say it in public at a meeting. You have to say it one-on-one, and you can only say the facts. You can't embellish. You can't say your opinion, your perspective. You say, look, I know this and this. Go look into it. I'm just telling you what I think I know, So it doesn't mean there is a place to speak something. Sometimes things have to be reported, that's life. People do bad things. They have to be held accountable. You can't say, I'm not going to say Lashon Hara. Someone commits a crime. You got to go tell the police. It's not Lashon Hara. You got to protect innocent people from this dangerous person who's a criminal, right? That's different. But just for entertainment purposes, for social engagement, Oh, did you hear about what happened to this person? Oh, did you hear this person got that? This person got this. That's gossip. And by the way, there's three levels you should know. There's three categories of lashon hara. In English, you would call it gossip, and then you would call it. There's no real word for the middle category. The lowest category is gossip. The middle category, I would say, in English, in Hebrew, it's called lashon hara. In Hebrew, it's called richilot, which is gossip. The middle level is lashon hara, which is negative speech. And the third level, which is the worst level, is motzi shem ra, which means in English slander. So what's the three categories? Gossip is, oh, did you hear so-and-so just bought a new boat, a 125 feet boat, and he's taking his friends on a trip to the Caribbean. It's not bad, but who said he wants everyone to know that business? That's not his, he doesn't want that publicized. Because you know what? Maybe his friend hears that and says, really? He bought a boat for 125 feet, 125, and he's taking his friends on a cruise to the Caribbean? Why didn't he invite me? Now I'm insulted. Who asked you to tell everybody that he bought a boat and he's going on a trip with his friends? That's not everyone's business. It's not bad. I didn't mean to say anything bad, but it's gossip. It's not your business. That's gossiping. Gossiping is like richilut, sharing other people's information that they didn't ask you to publicize, okay? That maybe you know about, but it doesn't, no one needs to know, okay? Worse than that is lashon hara. Did you hear this guy got fired from his job? Did you hear this guy, something else bad? You know what I mean? That's speaking bad about other people. Now it's true. It did happen. He got fired. But now you're spreading a bad word about him that he got fired, or you're saying that he, you know, whatever negative thing about him. But it's the truth, but you're spreading bad word about him that no one needs to know. It's his business. The third level, which is the worst, is slander. Motzi Shemra, where I spread a false rumor about you. In other words, they say you got fired, but you never got fired. But meanwhile, people think you got fired, right? Or whatever the bad rumor is, okay? Because now it's the worst of all, because you lied about somebody and you created a perception about them that's not even true. And that's the worst of all three. Now, interesting that I want to just share with you here is that what happened when a person spoke lashon hara? They got what is known as tsarat. Now, tsarat is very often translated as leprosy, but it's not leprosy because it wasn't a physical condition. You see, leprosy maybe is contagious, so you have to be quarantined so people don't catch it. You know, like COVID, it spreads, right? Everyone had to be quarantined, right? Leprosy is not about you're quarantined because you have to be in isolation because you isolated someone through your speech. You have to feel the pain of isolation by sitting alone. So when you come back into the community, you appreciate the gift of relationships and friendships and communication that is meant to bridge one soul with the next through positive interaction, not negative interaction. So it's not physical. And to prove it's not physical, the Talmud says if there was a groom who spoke lashon hara a day after his wedding, the Kohen would not examine his skin. Why? Because what's if it's lashon hara? He's going to have to be excommunicated from his own wife. It's the 7 days of celebration from the wedding. We don't want to ruin the wedding celebration. But if it's contagious, what do you mean? People are going to catch it. But it's not contagious. It was afflicted the person who spoke the lashon hara because it was a punishment for that person. And the Kohen, who was not a dermatologist but a spiritual person, would examine it to see. Because the Kohen is a person who spoke positive words. He would try to rehabilitate him and teach him how to speak positively and properly. But what's interesting about lashon hara, and you're going to read this in this week's Torah portion, is that there was, you know, the expression 3 strikes and you're out. You weren't thrown out of the community on your first mistake. First, the walls of your house got leprosy, which is like mold. Then it went on your garments, and then on your skin. Now, how do we know leprosy was a punishment for lashon hara? Because there are 2 stories in the Torah of 2 people who got leprosy, and guess who they were? Moses and his sister Miriam. Miriam, when she spoke lashon hara about her brother, that he was divorced from his wife, actually, Zipporah, And Moshe, when he spoke against the Jews, when God said to him in the burning bush, go take the Jews out, he said, they're not going to believe in me. And God says, why are you disparaging them? Why are you assuming the worst? Put your hand in your cloak. He came out, it was leprosy. Put it back, it was healed. So we see this affliction by Miriam and Moses has to do with speaking negatively. And the idea is, why leprosy on the skin? Because the idea is that it's a physical deformity, right? My skin is deformed. And the idea is that a person who speaks negatively about others is a deformed person. He is a person that is spiritually deformed because they are using the power of speech in a negative, harmful, hurtful way rather than a healing, beautiful, positive way that they can. And the Chafetz Chaim once said that sometimes people's prayers are not answered because imagine a doctor that performs a surgery with a scalpel that's contaminated. Not only won't he heal the patient, he'll kill the patient with all the germs and infections. He said, if you just use your mouth to speak bad against another person, and then you use that same mouth to ask God for a prayer, your mouth is contaminated. So keep your mouth pure and holy and righteous because you need this mouth to speak to God. You want to keep it sterile and pristine. But I want to go back to this idea of the three layers: your home, your clothing, and then your skin. And here we have another idea. You know, yesterday a young girl came to interview me from a Christian college about anti-Semitism. She's doing a photo journal, a documentary about it. And she said to me, what would you say to someone, to one of these, anti-Semitic people who are putting the projected swastika on the AT&T building? What would you say to them? And what I basically says, I would say to them is, that's not the real you. Discover your godly soul, because you are not created in the image of God to hate and to be anti-Semitic. That's something that you were taught maybe from your home, from your community, from your friends. Learn about the Jewish people, learn our history, meet a Jew, and get help, because you're hurting yourself more than anything else with this hatred and this anti-Semitism. And the idea is that everyone has a godly soul, but many people are taught to hate. And therefore, when a person has leprosy, you have to ask yourself, not just what's the story with this person? Why are they speaking negatively about others? Why are they hateful? Why are they speaking Lashon Hara? But what kind of a home did they grow up in? Because many a time, the messages we carry in life is things we absorbed in our home. So it starts with the walls of the home. And that's why in a home, the culture of the home should be one of, obviously, never bigotry or anti-Semitism or racism. Kids become racist. Maybe they heard their father at the dinner table talking like a racist, right? Or that the kids become anti-Semitic because they heard their father make anti-Semitic comments. So what are the people in your home hearing? What are the children hearing in the walls? Do they hear you at the dinner table saying good things about people, or they hear you speaking gossip around the dinner table, or worse than gossip, slander or Lashon Hara? So think about not just the person, think about the wall, the whole environment has to change. There was somebody who once made, the many restaurants in different places, there's like a little plastic card that sits folded. It has a big red circle with a cigarette that says no smoking, and they put it on the tables, right? I don't know if you ever see that around, right? So someone once made those plastic cards with a circle saying X, no Lashon Hara at this. And they put it down at the dinner table, in the middle of the table. We don't allow Lashon Hara at this table. Because when you think about it, like the meeting I told you this morning that I was part of, and somebody said something, I didn't trust this guy. Like, I didn't ask to hear that. You just poisoned me. You just polluted my earwaves. Just like when I smoke in your presence and I blow smoke in your face. You have to inhale that toxic, smoke. It's not right to put out smoke for other people, secondhand smoke. When you speak gossip, did you say, hey, I want to share with you Lashon Hara? Does everyone agree to hear? If you don't want to hear, walk away. That's a sin in itself. But at least you gave a person a chance to not hear it. I'm going to smoke a cigarette. If you don't want to smoke, walk out of the room. Okay, at least I could get out. But when someone just throws out something negative, now you have this thing in your head that this person is not trustworthy. I didn't ask to hear that. Why did you tell me that? What right do you have to poison my mind and heart with something negative about someone else? So it's wrong on so many different levels, okay? So the whole idea of Lashon Hara is, there are many mitzvot in the Torah. We know there's mishpatim, rational commandments like honor your father and mother, don't kill, don't steal. Then there's chukim. Chukim are commandments that we don't even know the reason. Don't mix milk and meat, don't mix wool and linen, or different things. Then there's eidut, like eat matzah and Passover, which makes sense. But then there are commandments that are very logical, very common sense, easy to understand. Like Lashon Hara, everyone would agree. Yeah, why should you speak gossip or negative speech or slander, right? But for some reason, the society we lived in completely ignores it, even though you think everyone would agree it's a bad thing. But for some reason, people accept it, justify it, and even enjoy it. And it's interesting that we live in a society where there are gossip shows, there are gossip columnists, where literally they publish negative stories about people on a daily basis in the newspaper. That's what a gossip columnist does. They spill the dirt or whatever it is. This guy's divorced, and this one did this, and this one did that, and this one got arrested, and this one got this. And the Torah would say, what? Like, you're a Lashon Hara columnist? You get up every day and commit the sin of Lashon Hara publicly? And it's much worse, because if I tell you, 2 people, 3 people, that's bad enough. Put it in a newspaper, now thousands of people read it. You just shamed someone in front of thousands of people. Why is that okay? Or if you put it on the internet, millions of people read that, right? Why do you have a right to destroy someone's life? Now, if they didn't do it, then it's even worse, because you've spread a rumor. But even if they did that, everyone makes mistakes. Would you want somebody to write all your mistakes on the internet? Would you want all your failures to be written in public? Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone has failures. Everyone does things they regret. What right does anyone have to publicize someone else's mistakes or failures or sins or whatever it is? That's between them and God. If they committed a crime, then it's between them and the government, But because newspapers sell by writing juicy stories, because people like gossip and they enjoy it, and that's another whole psychology. Why do people enjoy gossip? They enjoy gossip because it makes them feel good about themselves. Oh, I don't have that problem, so I'm better than that person. I feel good. Instead of feeling good about doing something good, you feel good by comparing yourself to someone else who has a problem. Oh, I didn't have that problem. I didn't do that bad thing, so I can feel good about myself. So there's a lot to be said on this subject, and it's a subject we should talk about more, because many people don't even know it's a problem. Unless you learn the Torah, you think it's okay. And if you listen in on a lot of conversations, if you walk into the average restaurant and you put a tape recorder down on the table, or the average card game in a country club, or average conversation on the telephone, I wonder if we recorded 15-minute snippets of 10 conversations, one here, one there, and listen to them. How many of them would not have any Lashon Hara? Because many, many times people go into talking about other people and their private things, that there's no place and no room and no excuse and no justification whatsoever, especially if you know something about someone that's private and you happen to have witnessed something or overheard something or experienced something. You don't go spreading, and someone asks, what's the way you atone for it? It's very difficult. It's one of the sins that's most difficult, because if I steal money from you, God forbid, I can return it, say, listen, I'm really sorry. I stole $100. I cheated you, God forbid. Please forgive me. Here's your $100 back. But if I went and told Lashon Hara about you to 50 people, I come back, I'm really sorry. I told 50 people something bad about you. Well, how do you undo it? I can't go press delete in their brains. They heard it. They know it. And those 50 people may have told another 50 people. And now it's like all over the place. And people look at you now like, oh, that guy's not so great. He did this, he did that. So there's some very serious problems here. Okay. And it's something that, we're going to spend the whole week learning about. And then Shabbat, read the Torah portion. You'll hear a lot of Dvar Torahs about Lashon Hara, but it's really something that takes a lot of discipline not to speak it. And it takes even more courage to be able to stand up to it. And before a person's about to, like, when I was at this meeting, so the person said, why didn't you trust him? And I said, we don't have to, it's Lashon Hara, let's not, we don't have to go there. But it was too late. He already said he didn't trust him. You know what I mean? So the bad word was out already. Now, I didn't let him go further to explain why. But the point is that, when someone starts speaking Lashon Hara, it takes a lot of courage to say, excuse me, but I don't want to hear that. And instead of letting him embarrass somebody else, I know he's going to be embarrassed in front of everyone at the table, but he doesn't have a right to share stories about other people. So when someone starts saying, you hear what this guy, whatever, and he's going into a story, you're like, maybe that's Lashon Hara, we shouldn't talk about that, And, a lot of times people change their behavior because of peer pressure. And if people know it's acceptable to speak about other people, they just do it. But if they know that, no, we're not going to tolerate that. Don't sit at my table at the Kiddush or at the Shabbos table or any table and share negative things. I don't want to hear that. And we have to take these laws very seriously. Now, again, sometimes you have to discuss things, obviously. Sometimes there's a problem that has to be solved and there's no way around it. I got to talk to you about a problem that we're dealing with and we want to solve it. But then the goal is to help the person, not to hurt the person. But if you're not trying to help somebody in any way, and when you're trying to hurt, and you always have to say, do you love the person, right? So, you may talk about a relative with another relative, you may, because you want to help the relative, right? But first you should talk to the person. But if you can't help them that way, you may have to help them another way. But it should be out of love and out of concern and protecting their integrity as much as possible, but not just doing it for fun because, we're bored, so let's talk about other people, because that's a nice way to entertain ourselves. And there shouldn't be TV shows that share gossip and there shouldn't be, gossip columnists. Now, again, sometimes in the news, they have to report something because the public needs to know certain things, maybe. We have to know when it's acceptable, when it's not acceptable. If somebody is a thief and the news reports it, people have to be careful, lock your cars, or I don't know, don't shop in the store because the guy's a crook. He was arrested for whatever, maybe there's a need for the public to know certain things. But about people's personal lives, that's just gossip. So it's a very, very important subject. And I always feel it's a subject that doesn't get enough attention, and in the general society is not even considered a problem. If you're a Jew and you learn Torah, it's a problem, it's wrong, it's a sin, it's an Aveirah, it's a terrible Aveirah. It's not just an ordinary Aveirah. But if you didn't learn Torah, you think it's perfectly acceptable. So it's an important subject. So wishing everyone a good day and a meaningful day. And we're reading, we're reading names downstairs for Holocaust Remembrance Day. And may our learning of Torah today be a memory of the 6 million to elevate their souls and remember this terrible tragedy, and remember the power of speech. Speech could be evil and destructive, and it could be a beautiful thing to bring people together, to unite people, to make love amongst people, like Aaron, the high priest, who examined the leprosy. He would say things to facilitate better relationships amongst people. Thank you all and have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining.